Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world today. My name is Herb and I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to our Big Book Telephone Step Workshop. Please join me in prayer for an open mind and an open heart. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Today is in Los Angeles, California, USA, July 31st, 2019, Wednesday. And I know that in Australia, it's Thursday. This is a very exciting day for us here in the workshop. We're winding up our step 1 journey and beginning our step 2 journey. Step 1 was a preparation and a foundation. Bill talks about in this next phase, step 2, a spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom. He never really says that step 1 is the foundation. He just implies it because he talks about the spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom and step 2 being the cornerstone. Step 2 being a cornerstone is the first stone put on a foundation to set the direction of the building or the arch. He talks about, metaphorically, a spiritual arch through which we're going to walk to a new freedom. In step 3, he continues that architectural analogy using the keystone for step 3. We'll talk more about that when we get there. The final time that he acknowledges this metaphor of the spiritual arch is at the conclusion of step 5, where he says we've walked through the arch. Obviously, there's some building blocks in an arch, but he doesn't mention it. Maybe he just assumes it and perhaps implies it with the meditation at the end of the 5th step, where he says, are the stones and the cement and the mortar, etc., all in place. So this is a wonderful vision for us. Now we've established some knowledge about step 1. That knowledge is really important. It doesn't make step 1 effective, but it's the beginning of making step 1 effective. I need to know that I don't have a choice and that it's a biological problem. I need to understand the terminology in the Big Book about a phenomenon of craving. Doctor's opinion, that's all it is. It's not science, just a psychiatrist's, a medical doctor's opinion back in 1935, 36, 37, 38, when they were looking at developing the Big Book. Something's wrong with our body in addiction. Now, he's referring it to alcohol, but something's wrong with our body in addiction. We don't need to know what that is. It's really irrelevant. Because our experience tells us that once I begin, I cannot stop. Now, sometimes it's every time, and sometimes it's periodic. It doesn't matter then, even. It's abnormal. Normal people do not have this problem. That's the whole point. Keep it really, 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 really simple. Normal people, if they have a problem of suffering because of one or two or three experiences, they will change their behavior. Trust me, you may not know normal people. But normal people don't continue to suffer like we have for decades, actually. And Bill very astutely says, well, if that's the problem, then stop it. And the real problem is that you can't stop it, even though you want to stop it, even though you know you should stop it, even though you know better, you can't do better. And so we have a problem with the mind. Our mind does not process reality about our addiction successfully. Bill uses the terms obsession and delusion, and we spent some time attempting to unpack that. But the real question for you, each of us on this call, is, did I ever stop for a period of time successfully and start again? And did I do that more than once, twice, three times? Well, it's not a trick question, although it sounds like it, because our experience is I've stopped many times and I've started every time. Sometimes with a little thought, sometimes with no thought at all. What is that? That's abnormal. Normal people don't think that way and act that way. They learn from the negative consequences of their behavior. Maybe not the first time or the second time, but certainly the third or fourth time. And they change so that they don't repeat the behavior and repeat the suffering. Theirs and others. It's really that simple. Dash, that our life had become unmanageable. Not connected to addiction, a separate thought, but connected to step one. Bill calls it powerless. I like to use the term no choice. When I put it in me, no choice. I will put more in me. When I don't put it in me and I make a resolution not to put it in me, I will put it in me. Sometimes with a little thought, sometimes with no thought at all. Dash. That my life had become unmanageable. And at 10 years of sobriety, I was given the gift of the set-aside prayer and a journey through unmanageability the way you've journeyed through it now, looking at the behavioral description of unmanageability in the bedevilments and the exact nature of that on pages 60 to 62, especially the two paragraphs on page 62. And he concludes his preparation for the first step on page 43. There'll come a time when we have no effective mental defense against the first drink, talking about the addiction. But he also concludes this second piece, this unmanageability piece, this spiritual malady piece, in the same manner on page 62, where he says our human resources as marshaled by the will failed utterly on page 45. And then he says on page 62, we can't even reduce it much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. We can know better, we just can't do better. Not effectively, not long term. That's unmanageability, that's the spiritual malady. So if in fact you've understood it, the big book's presentation, and you've looked at your own personal journey, and you have had an experience with any aspect of it, or maybe, hopefully, prayerfully, all aspects of it, then you've come to a conclusion that you need power. Power other than yours, because God knows you've tried. Human development, psychology, religion, therapy. A variety of efforts on your own power, spending time and money and being well-intentioned and defeated. Surrender is the right term for step one. We're completely dependent on our own power. It's a process. Like the dimmer switch goes up a notch at a time, not the light switch. Boom, it goes on. That's that spiritual experience that Bill Wilson had, not mine. Dimmer switch. Took 10 years for me to have a full step one experience. Not that I knew that in advance, thank God, but in retrospect, as I look back over my shoulder. But then that prepared me, that journey in 1994, 10 years sober, given the set-aside prayer, having an experience with unmanageability, it prepared me for that first question in step two that I asked you to ask yourself. What do I actually believe about God? Assignment 6. I hope you wrote it out, a sentence perhaps, a word, a phrase, maybe even a page, it doesn't matter. As long as you've written something down for yourself as a baseline, so that you're not vague, you have a reference point. You wrote something down in answer to that question. What do I actually believe? I didn't say, what do you think, want, feel, know, read, all of that. You've heard me last time. No, I asked you, what do you believe? Obviously, it's important to know what belief means, so I asked you to look that up. Now we're going to look at some material that Bill introduces us to as a journey toward belief and what that means, and having your own new belief, perhaps. Hear the words of step 2, came to believe. Not a light switch. Certainly not my experience, but even the vocabulary of the big book. Came to believe. Over time. Bill had a mountaintop experience. Second day in the hospital, he worked the steps. The third day in the hospital, he was taken to the top of a mountain. In his explanation of his experience, the room filled with light. He was overwhelmed with the sense of the presence of God. He said it felt like a clean wind blew through him. And that at the end of the 20-minute period, that's in other literature, not in the big book, but at the end of that 20-minute period, he knew two things. Number one, that his alcohol problem had been permanently removed. And number two, that his life's destiny was to carry that message to help the suffering alcoholic to get free from their addiction. You could look at that, and we will, as part of this journey on step 2, in the second half of Bill's story. Page 13, he works the steps with Ebby Thatcher on the second day of his hospitalization, And on page 14, he gives us a paragraph that describes generally what I just described from my overall reading and amalgam of all of those experiences as he's described them in different places. Very powerful. And he was never really attempted to drink again after that. Never relapsed. That's, he calls a spiritual experience. Light switch, not typically our experience. Most of us will have the dimmer switch. Here I was 10 years sober, having done the work twice, and I'd had experiences with a variety of the steps, but none with steps 2 or 3. I didn't know that I didn't have any experience with steps 2 and 3. I just went through them. I did the suggested exercises and reading and reflection and writing and discussing, and went on to step 4 and the balance of the steps, and had very powerful experiences. So not having an experience, a new experience, or with steps 2 and 3 did not prevent me from having very life-transforming spiritual awakenings. I want to make that point. But I prayed the set-aside prayer. I had a new experience with unmanageability. I understood and experienced the spiritual malady for the very first time, and I answered that question, what do I actually believe about God? And I wrote it out, and I came to this man's house and I read it out. And it was beautiful. It was theologically very sound and poetic, aesthetic, actually, in its structure. And then he said, thank you, Herb, for sharing that. Now, go home and write out an answer to this question. And this is the question that's on assignment 7. And this will be your assignment for next week, or between now and then. Reflect on it. Hold this second question. And by the time we get on the call next week, have written out some form of an answer for yourself. The first question that hopefully you've entertained, reflected on, and written out a little bit of an answer to, what is it that you actually believe? Now, the second question that he asked me, that I am now asking you, is how do you behave in light of what you said you believe? How do you behave in light of what you said you believe you believe? It was a veil-rending question, and I say that poetically, certainly, but literally veil-rending. I didn't know that I didn't know. And I couldn't see that I didn't see that I was a practical agnostic. The two words that Bill uses, agnostic and atheist, come from the Greek language. Gnosis, Gnosis, means knowledge. And when you put an A in front of it, agnosis, it means no knowledge or doubt. Likewise, the word atheist comes from theos, the base root, Theos, meaning God. And when you put an A in front of it, it means not God. So an agnostic has some doubt about whether or not there is this power or God existence, and whether or not it's even knowable. And an atheist is firm There is no God. There is no power. There is no immaterial reality. There is no spiritual world. There is only the material world. That's the position of the atheist. And Bill says at the beginning of the chapter 4, not a problem. 50% of us are like that in some form, not a problem. That's why the wording of the step is so important, came to believe. So the assignment now is to reflect on this question. Don't ready, fire, aim. Hold the question in the milieu of the set-aside prayer. And take a look practically at your days, at your life, at your behavior. How do I behave in light of what I said I believed about God? Well, I wasn't in a daily meditation on a consistent basis, which means I didn't actually believe that there was a power. And if I did, then I didn't believe that the power cared and would intervene and help me. Not intellectually. I would never have been able to articulate any doubt in that area at all, because I didn't have any intellectual doubt, academic doubt. But I had practical doubt that escaped my consciousness. And when I want to know the truth today, I look at my feet. How am I behaving? My behavior tells me what I believe. My behavior tells me what my principles are. My behavior tells me what my character is. Not my head, not my feelings. My behavior. Very confrontive. You really want to know what you believe? Look at your feet. You really want to know who you are and what your character is? Look at your feet. How do you behave? When nobody's looking. When you're just completely on your own. How are you thinking? How are you feeling? Indicators, but how are you behaving? The beginning of inventory process. Bill has a nice technique in the book where he asks questions at the beginning of a new section. On chapter 4, we looked at pages 44 and 45 as part of the unmanageability exercise and assignment. But now as part of the step 2 beginning assignment, we're again looking at page 45, where Bill says, lack of power is our dilemma. And we have to find a power greater than ourselves. It's in italics. It's the big book's way of highlighting. He says, obviously, but where and how are we going to find that power? Here are the questions. Where and how? These are rhetorical. They're setting us up. It's the literary style. He's not going to answer the question for 10 pages. He's going to discuss it from a variety of viewpoints: science, poetry, philosophy, salesmanship, cajoling, common sense, logic. He's going to try all kinds of ways for us to take a look at this question. Where and how are we going to find this power? Notice he doesn't say find God. Power with a capital P. Well, that's exactly what this book is about, is the first sentence of the next paragraph. Its main object is to enable me to find a power greater than myself, which will solve my problem. Oh, well, what's my problem? No, your addiction is not your problem. No, your behavior is not your problem. Lack of power is your problem. And you just said it at the top. Lack of power is our dilemma. And we've just come out of, I hope, an experience of unmanageability. defined as the spiritual malady, defined as self-will run riot, selfishness and self-centeredness, and we can't even reduce it much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. We had to have a intervention from a power or a source or a resource other than what we've been able to connect to so far. And now I'm broadening it, because the Buddhists talk about the higher self, and the psychologists talk about the true self, and some of the philosophers talk about the human spirit, nature with a capital N, energy with a capital E, source with a capital S. Doesn't make any difference what the word is. The real question here is there going to be help available to me to be more effective with my life than I have been up to this very point? Broad, all-inclusive. Now, Bill talks about the set-aside attitude in the final paragraph there. He says, we have shared honest doubt and prejudice, particular ideas of God, which we have abandoned, actually, all right? Or, in fact, dismissed. Page 46. We think faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves weak. And then we ask these questions. Here's the logic. How can there be God, supreme being, with all this chaos in the world and all this suffering of innocent people? Huge philosophical questions that have been asked forever in recorded history. But on page 46, he says, if we can lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe, there it is, that set-aside attitude again, we will get results, even though it's impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power. It's impossible for us to find the right word or the right concept. And if you stop for just a minute, I'm asking you to right now. We're material beings. We're finite. We had a beginning, we have an end. It's impossible for us to really adequately think beyond our own personal experience. Materiality is our only experience. Beginning and end is our only experience. And Bill is talking here now about immateriality, the world of the spirit, infinite in contrast to finite. We can use the terms, but we don't really know what they mean, other than we can define them. But I meant experientially, no. Intellectually, sure. Experientially, not so much. Much to our relief, he says, we discovered we don't need to consider anybody else's conception. Our own conception, however inadequate, and it always will be inadequate, any word that you choose for a power other than yourself will be inherently wrong. I mean, in the sense of objective. It's perfectly right for you. But as an objective reality, we can't name it. Because any name that we give it is a finite name, and we're naming with a finite word something that we intend to be infinite. A metaphor, we cannot put the ocean in a bucket. The bucket's just not that large. It really puts it in perspective. God or power or source, resource, is the ocean. And our words, whatever those words, I don't care how large your bucket is, it's never going to contain the ocean. But we can make an approach, he says on page 46, to effect a contact with God. As soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, capital C, capital I, now he's going to give us lots of vocabulary, lots of alternatives, lots of synonyms, so that we can explore. What do we resonate with? Creative intelligence. Sounds like image and likeness. For me, I have a mind and a will, a mind that knows and a will that decides and takes action. Creative intelligence. A spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things. I love that, the poetry of that. A spirit of the universe, capital S, capital U. Underlying the totality of things. There's a $100 word you might want to look up, immanence. It's a theological term. It'll give you some feel for the concept that Bill is trying to impart to us metaphorically or poetically. We began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided, always the caveat, always the qualifier, we took other simple steps. Oh, step 2 is just at the beginning. And the real power is in completing the steps, came to believe, maybe by the end of the step work, if not before. We found that God does not make two-hearted terms with those who seek him. To us, the realm of spirit, capital R, capital S. Pay attention to the words with an initial capital letter in the midst of a sentence. Those are all synonyms for the God of our not understanding. Then here's where he talks about broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding. Again, a caveat to those who earnestly seek. When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice, that set aside prayer again, against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking, what do they mean? At the start, this is all you need to commence spiritual growth, to effect your first conscious relation with God as we understood God. And afterwards, we found ourselves accepting much more. Richard Rohr, one of my teachers, says, faith is a decision to accept without any evidence. And once we accept, the evidence appears. It's beautiful. It's totally my experience. We needed to ask ourselves but one short question. Bill is suggesting here a task for us, a question. This is not interesting reading, novel type. This is a textbook. He's saying we need to ask ourselves this question. Do I now believe, or am I willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself, a power other than myself? As soon as a person says that I do believe or am willing to believe, we are on our way. There, he says, this is the cornerstone upon which a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. There are many articles of faith which are so plain to him, it was comforting to learn that we could commence at a simpler level. Accepting this on faith. So there's another question for you. What is faith? It's one of the questions in the assignment. This is the first of the first step of the second step questions, page 47. Do I now believe, or am I willing to believe? If you don't believe, you're an agnostic or an atheist or some other form of resistance. That's just fine, because he gives us a fallback position. Are you willing to believe that there may be a resource available to you that you're not aware of, but that you desperately need in order to get over the goal line, whatever that goal line is, of changing your behavior, changing your life? Get off the merry-go-round and stop the madness. So for next week, we will continue looking at chapter 4. You might want to review Appendix 2. That's illustrated in the big book with an asterisk suggesting that we revisit that so that we understand what is a spiritual awakening, what is a spiritual experience, how they're different and how they're the same. They're very relevant in this particular journey on step 2. And take a look at the balance of assignment 6 and assignment 7 now, with that second question that I've asked you from the assignment. The first question from assignment 6, what do I actually believe? Actually believe. And from assignment 7, now, how do I behave when I'm looking at that? Is there any type of incongruence between what I think, what I believe, and how I behave? All right, Andy. That's it for the day today. And join me in the serenity prayer, please. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.